Okay, so we're diving into some pretty deep waters today, folks, tackling some big questions that you've all sent our way.
Yeah, and they're all coming from this one really fascinating text, Plato's Gorgias.
Right. So we're going to be trying to sort of unravel, I guess, this whole knotty relationship between the art of persuasion, so rhetoric, and these really fundamental ideas about justice and virtue.
And it's not just a bunch of dusty old ideas, right? Like, it's super relevant to how we think about communication and leadership and, well, even just how to live a good life, even today.
Totally. So we're going to kind of journey through these really dynamic debates, right, between Socrates and his buddies, see if we can figure out if being able to convince people, being persuasive, is somehow actually linked to being, a good and just person.
Like, does true skill in rhetoric require some sort of moral foundation?
Exactly. And I got to say, there are some real mind-bending moments in these conversations, like the idea that a truly masterful speaker, a true rhetorician, almost have to be just.
That's a wild thought.
Totally. And then there's this, really unexpected comparison of rhetoric to something kind of like cooking.
Okay, that's definitely not what I was expecting going into this dialogue.
Right. It's kind of a curveball.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole back and forth about whether happiness is actually tied to being just or whether injustice somehow even leads to a better life.
Yeah, that's the age-old debate. Does power corrupt, or is it the key to true happiness?
Right. Right. So, where do we even start with all this?
Well, one of the most interesting things is how Socrates kicks things off. Like, right out of the gate, he goes straight to the heart of what rhetoric actually is. He asks Gorgias point blank, rhetoric's this skill, this art that works through words, but words about what exactly?
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's like before we can even assess if it's good or bad or whatever, we have to figure out what it's even about.
Exactly. And Gorgias, he seems super sure of himself at first, right? He says, oh, rhetoric, that's easy. It deals with the greatest and the best of all human things.
Which, that sounds pretty impressive, right?
It definitely sounds ambitious. But Socrates, being Socrates, he's not letting him get away with that kind of vague grandeur. He's like, hold on, let's break this down a bit.
Yeah, with his classic line of questioning.
Right, with his persistent, almost annoying way of getting to the bottom of things. And he uses these really simple, everyday examples to show how fuzzy that definition is.
Think about medicine, for instance. A doctor could say, hey, I'm dealing with the greatest good, human health.
Right. Or someone who's into physical training. They could be all, well, strength and fitness are the best things in life.
Or, even someone who's all about making money, they could argue that financial security is the key to happiness, the ultimate good.
Exactly. So Socrates is saying that Gorgias's sweeping statement doesn't really tell us what makes rhetoric different from all these other things that people might see as essential for a good life.
So Gorgias has to kind of rethink things a little bit.
And he ends up refining his definition to say that rhetoric is the artificer of persuasion.
Which, okay, that sounds a lot more specific, right? It's about making people believe things, convincing them. But Socrates still isn't completely satisfied, is he?
No, he's not. Because the question then becomes, what kind of persuasion are we talking about? And how does that connect to this whole question of justice and virtue?
Right. It's just because you can persuade someone of something, does that mean it's the right thing or the just thing?
Exactly. And Socrates really digs into the nature of persuasion. He makes this critical distinction between belief and knowledge.
So there's a difference between just believing something and actually knowing it for sure.
Yeah, and Socrates is saying that rhetoric often deals more with creating belief than with actual knowledge. You can be persuaded of something without fully understanding it, without having all the facts.
Which, think about advertising. It's all about making you believe you need that new gadget or whatever.
Right, or political speeches. They're designed to sway your opinion, but they don't necessarily give you a comprehensive view of every issue.
Exactly. And Socrates points out that this kind of persuasion is especially potent in, courts of law and public assemblies, places where decisions are made about what's just and unjust. Which, that makes a lot of sense, right? Think about a trial. A lawyer's job isn't necessarily to, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what happened. It's more about convincing the jury to believe their client's version of events.
Exactly. And Socrates even gives this pretty striking example to illustrate his point. He says that a really skilled speaker, someone who's good at rhetoric, could actually be more persuasive than a real doctor when talking about medical stuff, especially if the audience doesn't know much about medicine.
So it's the power of persuasion doesn't always equal the truth.
Right. The rhetorician might be able to sway people, but does that mean what they're saying is actually accurate or healthy?
And this leads to a really interesting point about the ethical implications of rhetoric. If you have the power to persuade people, do you have a responsibility to use that power for good, for just causes?
That's a huge question.
It is. And it's something that Socrates gets really fired up about. He actually makes this really bold claim that a rhetorician who truly knows what justice is like, really understands it, would never willingly act unjustly.
So he's connecting knowledge and action in a really direct way.
Right. It's almost like he's saying if you truly understand what's right, you can't help but do what's right.
Which, I mean, that's a pretty optimistic view of human nature.
It is, right. It's assuming that knowledge and morality are kind of inseparable.
And Gorgias pushes back on this, understandably. He's like, come on, rhetoric is just a tool like anything else. It can be used for good or bad.
Yeah, he makes this comparison to physical abilities.
Mm.
If you train someone to be a super strong athlete, they could use that strength to help people, or they could use it to bully people.
Right. It's not the trainer's fault if the athlete chooses to use their strength in a bad way. And Gorgias is saying it's the same with rhetoric. A teacher can't be blamed if a student uses their persuasive skills for unjust ends.
It's like the skill itself is neutral. It's the intention behind it that matters.
Exactly. But Socrates sees a kind of contradiction in Gorgias's argument. Like, if rhetoric is all about discussing justice and injustice, like Gorgias himself said earlier, how can someone who truly understands those concepts then turn around and act unjustly?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like if you really grasp the principles of justice, wouldn't that understanding kind of compel you to act justly?
Socrates seems to think so. He's basically saying that there shouldn't be this disconnect between what we know and what we do, especially when it comes to matters of right and wrong.
So we've got this tension between the power of persuasion and the responsibility that comes with it.
Yeah, and then things get even more interesting when Paulus enters the scene. He's got a whole different take on rhetoricians.
He sees them as these super powerful figures, almost like tyrants. He thinks they can basically get whatever they want because they're so good convincing people.
And Socrates challenges this notion of power head on.
Right? He's like, hold on. Just because you can influence people doesn't mean you're truly doing what you will.
He makes this really subtle distinction between doing what you want in the moment and doing what's actually in your best interest, what you would truly will if you understood what was truly good for you.
And this connects back to his whole idea about justice being the ultimate good.
Exactly. Socrates is saying that even tyrants and rhetoricians who seem to have all this power might be making choices that ultimately harm them because they're not aligned with what's truly good and just.
He actually brings up this really interesting idea that all our actions, even seemingly simple ones like sitting or walking, are ultimately driven by what we perceive as good.
So we're always striving for something we think is beneficial, even if it's just on a subconscious level.
Right. And Socrates takes it even further, saying that even actions that we would consider bad or harmful, like killing or exiling someone, are done with the belief that they'll lead to some kind of good outcome for the person doing them.
So even injustice is committed in the name of some perceived good.
Right. Which means if Socrates is right about justice being the true good, then anyone acting unjustly is actually working against their own best interests, even if they don't realize it.
It's like they're mistakenly pursuing something that will ultimately make them unhappy.
And that leads to this really fascinating debate between Socrates and Paulus about happiness, justice, and injustice.
Yeah, they use the example of Archelaus, this Macedonian ruler who was known for being incredibly ruthless and ambitious.
Oh, he did some pretty terrible things to gain power.
Right, and Paulus is arguing that, hey, despite all that, Archelaus is probably happy because he's powerful and he's gotten away with his crimes.
But Socrates is like, no way, man.
Yeah.
He's adamant that those who act unjustly are inherently unhappy, regardless of whether they get punished or not.
Because, for Socrates, injustice itself is a kind of sickness of the soul.
Yeah, it's like a corruption that eats away at you from the inside.
And what's really interesting is that Socrates actually suggests that those who are punished for their injustices might be better off than those who aren't.
So he's saying that punishment can actually be a good thing.
Yeah, in a way. Because he sees it as a kind of purification, a way of purging the soul of its injustice.
It's like a bitter medicine that ultimately heals you.
Exactly. And Socrates even says that committing injustice is far worse, far more shameful than suffering
Which
injustice.
is kind of a radical idea, right? We
Mm.
usually think of the victim as being in the worst position.
Right, but Socrates is flipping that on its head. He's saying that the real harm is to the soul of the person who does wrong, not the person who's wronged.
And then, to make things even more complex, Callicles jumps into the conversation.
Yeah, and he brings a totally different perspective. Like, he basically equates what's better with what's stronger.
He's all about, like, natural law, survival of the fittest.
Right, and he thinks that the truly virtuous person is the one who can satisfy all their desires no matter what. He sees self-control and moderation as weaknesses.
So it's like a complete rejection of everything Socrates has been saying.
Pretty much. And Socrates, being Socrates, he doesn't shy away from the challenge. He starts poking holes in Callicles' argument with his usual line of questioning.
Like, he asks whether two strong people are automatically better than one, or if a bunch of slaves are better than their master just because there are more of them.
He's trying to show that strength and power don't necessarily equal goodness or justice.
In Callicles, he kind of has to refine his position. He ends up saying that the people who should rule, the ones who are truly superior, are those who are wise and courageous in managing the state.
So he's bringing in some idea of merit, not just brute force.
Right. But Socrates still isn't satisfied. He asks whether these wise and courageous rulers are also able to rule themselves, to control their own desires.
It's like he's saying true leadership isn't just about bossing other people around, it's about mastering yourself first.
Exactly. And this leads to a really interesting discussion about pleasure versus the good.
Yeah, Socrates directly challenges Callicles' hedonistic worldview, the idea that pleasure is the ultimate goal.
He uses this really vivid analogy, comparing a life of constant pleasure-seeking to a leaky jar that can never be filled.
It's like you're always trying to satisfy your desires, but they just keep leaking out and you never feel truly content.
Right, and Socrates contrasts that with a life of temperance, where your needs are met and you have control over your desires. He's saying that this kind of life is actually more fulfilling, more truly happy.
And he makes this really interesting point about the difference between pleasure and pain versus good and evil. He says that pleasure and pain always end together, right? Like when the pleasure stops, the pain stops too.
But good and evil aren't like that. They have a more lasting effect.
Right. And Socrates is suggesting that this means there's a fundamental difference between them. Pleasure and pain are fleeting sensations, but good and evil have a deeper, more enduring significance.
So he's saying that true happiness, true well-being, comes from pursuing what's good, not just what feels good in the moment.
And he applies this idea to leadership and statesmanship. He says that a true statesman should be like a doctor or a physical trainer focused on the genuine well-being of their patient, which in this case is the state.
They should be trying to improve the moral character of the citizens, not just catering to their whims and desires.
And he actually criticizes some famous Athenian leaders for failing to do this. He says they focus too much on material things, like building harbors and walls, and not enough on cultivating justice and temperance in the people.
So he's saying that a truly great leader cares about the souls of the people, not just the outward appearance of the state.
Exactly. And this ties back to the whole question of rhetoric. Should it be used just to persuade people, or should it be used to guide them towards what's truly good and just?
Right, right. And at the end of the dialogue, Socrates basically urges everyone, including us, the readers, to follow the logic of the argument.
He's saying that if you really think things through, you'll see that living a life of justice and virtue is the best way to live, both in this life and in whatever might come after.
And he basically dismisses Callicles' view, the whole idea that happiness comes from just indulging all your desires, as shallow and ultimately unsatisfying.
So we're left with this really powerful idea that rhetoric, this art of persuasion, can be a force for good, but only if it's grounded in a deep understanding of justice and virtue.
And I think the big takeaways for us, the listeners, are like, first, that maybe there's a connection between being a truly effective speaker and being a just person.
Like maybe you can't be truly persuasive if you're not also striving to be good.
And then there's this idea that rhetoric, when it's misused, is basically just a fancy form of flattery.
It's manipulating people for your own gain rather than trying to help them.
And finally, there's this really challenging notion that injustice, even if you get away with it, ultimately leads to unhappiness.
Because it corrupts your soul, even if it brings you worldly success.
So we're in this world where we're constantly bombarded with persuasive messages,
Hmm.
right? From ads to social media to political speeches. And the question is, how do we tell the difference between rhetoric that's trying to manipulate us and rhetoric that's actually trying to lead us towards what's good?
Like, how do we develop the skills to see through the BS and discern what's truly worth believing in and fighting for?
And maybe even more importantly, how do we cultivate virtue in ourselves so that we're not so easily swayed by empty promises and appeals to our baser instincts?
That's a challenge for all of us.
It is. And I think it's something that Plato really wanted us to grapple with. So, yeah, I hope this deep dive has given you all some food for thought.
Definitely. And if you have any other questions or like want to explore these ideas further, you know where to find us.
Thanks for listening, everyone.